Heidi ho there, friends and neighbors. This is your host, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. Welcoming you to another episode of Cannabis Talk. It's 3:52. You got 45 minutes? I know I do. Welcome back, folks. Thanks for tuning in. Let's talk about cannabis stuff. Let's talk about sex. No. I was, of course, my memory was triggered and I was thinking about that song which will age me to the audience, or at least pinpoint those who know the song, what bracket I generally belong to, but I forget who it was because I'm terrible about keeping chronicles of entertainment and stuff. But, let's talk about sex, baby. Let's talk about you and me. Everybody knows the song. Everybody of a certain age knows the song. Everybody else under that age is probably children of the people that I'm talking about. Let's talk about cannabis. We need a remake of that song. Let's talk about sex. It's going to be, let's talk about cannabis. Although, cannabis is too many syllables, I suppose. At any rate, I digress. Welcome to my unscripted, ad hoc cannabis chit-chat show, which is currently, not quite what it aspires to be, because it lacks the co-host and guest or two to have the whole broader chit-chat conversation with about whatever we're going to talk about today. What are we going to talk about today? Too many things. I don't want to carry over too many things from other segments. But maybe I'll hit some of them. Alright. I'm just kind of reviewing my cards. So, for those who are new to my collection of podcast projects, and if you don't know, I obviously am pro-cannabis. I call it cannabis instead of weed because cannabis is like its formal scientific name, or at least it's much more directly related to its formal scientific name, giving it a sense of formality, at least above words like weed and pot and dope. And also, I think philosophically, because, and I don't want to sound too highfalutin here, but weed, pot, dope, grass, those are all words, whether they originated with like the system of oppression that criminalized this plant or not, whether it was their idea or not, they ultimately utilized them in their war against drugs, in their propaganda, and gave it all a negative, connotation. The one that wigs me out the most is dope, because it also is used by other to represent other substances, substances that I'm even way less inclined to use. That I'm more against than alcohol per se. To put it in perspective, not that I'm totally hardcore against alcohol. I'm not. I'll say it again. I'm sure I've said it before. I'm not a teetotaler. I'm not an abolitionist. I just think that everyone deserves to have a clear education about alcohol, what it actually is, what it actually does to you, before they start building a habit-forming relationship with it, and that we could just handle the whole thing as a cultural norm in a completely different way than the way we do. But this show is not about bashing alcohol. It is about sharing thoughts and extolling the grooviness of cannabis, and not just from like a mindless, I'm a big fan, I love weed, so I got to say good things about weed. I'm not one of those kinds of people. Anybody who knows me really well knows that I'm not fanatical by nature. It's the technical reason why I excuse myself. It's not just why, it's how I think I actually energetically, mentally, spiritually excuse myself from the burden of memorizing a bunch of names and associated statistics in areas like sports ball and and entertainment, where I don't feel compelled. I don't want to feel like it's compulsory that I know all these people's names, not out of disrespect for them or out of lack of human understanding or compassion or love or whatnot. I think I'm slightly more advanced than that. But I'm not fanatical about anything, so it's not like I'm going to talk about a specific team ever a lot. Or listen to one musician more than any other. In fact, nowadays, the only time I ever really listen to music is in the car, when I can't find news. Don't judge me on that, because I don't listen to the news blindly. I listen to the news quite critically in understanding how it functions. At least a version of the more, nefarious version of how news functions. So yeah. Here's a fun fact about me when it comes to cannabis. I am the same way about cannabis as I am about sports ball. For example, I went to the dispensary not more than a week ago to get myself my medicine, because it is genuinely medicine. But I don't obsess over this strain has these qualities, that strain, the way a wine connoisseur might. And it's funny because it's the best example. And I used to work in the wine industry, and I had to pretend, I had to fake it, not fake it. I had to read other people's stuff and take it on their word and peddle that. Because I would drink wine and it would taste like wine. I would drink red wine and it would taste like red wine. I would drink red wine of a different kind and it would be like, well, that's what red wine of that grape tastes like, but it still tastes pretty red and pretty wine-ish. So winey. Well, I don't want to use winey, right? It's the wrong word. But I didn't really get into smoking cannabis until right before the medicinal movement made its big change. And I didn't pick it up for the reasons most people pick it up. The very, 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 very first time I was offered cannabis by any other human being, I obviously had heard about it. I'd seen reference to it in pop culture stuff, and I had known people who was into it and smoked it, but I'd never been in its presence. No one had ever offered me any until this one day, and I was already in college the first time around. So I was 20. I don't think I was 21 yet, although it's not impossible. It could have happened after I turned 21. That whole 4-year period is a big mishmash because of the stress and the drinking. Not that I drank a lot in college. I didn't start drinking until I was 21, but then after I did start drinking, I did enjoy it. I think quite in the I'm a responsible kind of person kind of way. And I did not smoke pot very much. And I did smoke pot once with a group of people at that time, and nothing. It had almost zero effect on me. Whereas alcohol, it's like before the first beer is done, you feel the effect. And I didn't kind of grow up in a pot culture the way a lot of people who are part of the cannabis community, medical and recreational, sort of did, And right before it became medicinally acceptable, I had moved to San Francisco. And before that, I lived in Ventura. And Ventura was pretty progressive in its attitude about cannabis, let's say. Even the police were pretty no, you know what? You stoners aren't really the problem. It's the people who steal stuff and kill people that are the problem. And sometimes that's over cannabis, but very rarely. That was their general attitude, from what I understood. Not that cops explain their attitude to me a lot. That's just from what I gathered. What the word on the street seemed to be was that it was a pretty low priority offense, and that they, met some minimum quotas to keep the state happy or whatnot, and that they weren't really out to bust up the sort of well entrenched avenues of people sharing cannabis with each other, because most people, even at this time in history, most people who want to have access to cannabis and want to provide access to cannabis to others generally didn't think of themselves as drug dealers until they did, until it became like the label that had to be applied to them. For most people, this plant is, I think, based on the people I've known. There was a point in time, though, and I'll tell you this, and I say this retrospectively with hindsight, not with personal experience from the time, that there was a time when it became cool to be that there are different kinds of drug dealers, right? Well, there was a time when being a drug dealer in the pop cultural sense of the term meant like being a really hardcore bad person who sold really horrible things, like, baked in a basement somewhere. And then it kind of eventually morphed into, a guy that sells weed. And almost kind of begrudgingly, people in the cannabis culture took that on because it's, our conviction for a lot of us, maybe not all of us, is that it's not a drug. Now, I know that there are people who look at it as a drug, treat it like a drug, use it like a drug, insist that it is a drug. And I'm using the word drug like, in the sense of some kind of highly addictive narcotic that is also severely damaging to the human body. I think those myths, however much evidence has been brought forth so far, are still being held onto by a lot of people, especially in the overlapping realms of medicine, pharmaceuticals, and recovery of addiction. Addiction recovery the addiction recovery folks are kind of caught between a hard place and a rock. The hard place being that there's increasing amounts of evidence that cannabis helps heroin addicts get off heroin, that cannabis helps alcoholics get off alcohol, and that how can a plant and its ingredients, its nutrition that it's giving you, is the way I like to think of it, not just figuratively, mind you. I like to think of it that way literally too. I think we should be eating it. I've rambled about that in a previous episode, I think. How can something like this plant that, when ingested responsibly and ethically and in moderation, will alleviate all the obstacles, biologically speaking, the pain, the withdrawal symptoms, all those horrible things, the psychological, a lot of the anxiety, it'll just eases those enough or away enough, it alleviates them enough that the addict can then focus their mind and their energies, and in my perspective, their spirit, to rewire themselves in order to end that addiction. How can that thing be addictive then? Right? Call me crazy if this is a new concept to you, if you're not sure that what I'm talking about is real or just I'm blowing smoke up your butt. I'm not. There's the research is slowly beginning to get done. And I've advocated for that in previous episodes, and I really think it's the next thing. First of all, as a member of the community, and forever and forever, let us always give thanks to those brave individuals who faced down threats of incarceration and protested and what's the other term? Engaged in the political process of proposing legislation here in California and in all the other states that have done so. That we are slowly, changing the national understanding of the plant, both in terms of the law, its relationship with the law, and its relationship to our bodies, enough that we might actually be coming close to decriminalizing it, declassifying it entirely from its class A1 highly addictive narcotic classification, which I guarantee you it is not. If it were, I'd be freaking the fuck out. So would everybody else, who smokes pot and then doesn't have pot. So some people do. I've witnessed that behavior in people, but then they have also exhibited that behavior over other things that they clearly have an addictive styled attachment that are not in and of themselves inherently addictive. Like, they really need that blanket, and they freak out and they have withdrawal symptoms from not having that blanket. Now, a blanket by itself categorically cannot be habit forming in terms of the way in which blankets traditionally interact with the human mind chemistry. That form of addiction is not occurring, other than that we have some internal triggers that our attachment to that object might trigger, which would be similar, but it's not the same. It's not the blanket itself, is it now? It's our own mind. So addiction gets reduced down to this horrible place. Why am I talking about this on Cannabis Talk? Because as someone who has confronted my relationship with, or is confronting my relationship with, other substances, I have to give an earnest and honest assessment to my relationship with this substance. Because, one can be quickly convinced by those motivated by the opposite team's agenda to clarify it, to declare it or quantify it as wrong, as immoral, as worthy of being illegal. Many of them have pretty seductive arguments. But I think that science and direct personal experience can win the tide over in terms of a national movement, not only to decriminalize, but to, more importantly, in my opinion, humbly, I propose to anybody willing to listen, to craft a responsible, intelligent, cultural set of norms around it. A healthier set of norms around it than around alcohol, right? Alcohol is something, for better or for worse, the American people, we the people, our predecessors, if not our direct ancestors, they fought it out. They really fought it in the most hardcore, old school sense of the term, of fighting for one's perceived rights. And we had a big, violent set of years that ended up in a very serious, legal contests to see who ought to win. And we decriminalized alcohol. It was foolhardy to have criminalized it in the abrupt and ridiculous way that they'd had. You can't heal an addict, because alcohol is two things: a tasty adult beverage that you can drink and never be addicted to, and something that is highly addictive to a lot of people. This is one of those things where the phenomena of addiction is not emergent from the alcohol itself. It's in the relationship, both at the physiological level, so the chemistry level, and at the mental level, the mental... As I will reference AA with deep respect. As AA points out, there's a mental disorder going on there. There's a mental disease, I think is the word that they use. Forgive me for saying the incorrect one. Like some kind of when you have an allergy, there's like a mental allergy. There's a mental obsession, and that can't be denied, right? Like that has to be addressed. You could cure the body of it, and a person could go off and not drink for 8 years, 10 years. And then the obsession continues in the mind, and while they might have been chemically castrated of the short-term reliance on alcohol to get through their day, ultimately the mind obsession / dependence might, whittle their own discipline and self-control down to break them down again. So as we move forward, if I wasn't of the mind that I am, and that's that there's a spiritual dimension to this and all things, so cannabis must have a spiritual dimension, right? My spirituality is that the material plane is imbued, saturated, and floating in the spiritual plane, and that most religions are peddling a lie of separation, and that's what the mystics are talking about. The lie of separation is an illusion. That the kingdom of heaven is here and now, simultaneous, and somehow contained within our experiencing of this mundane, boring world. Mundane and boring being ego trap words, because this beautiful, amazing phenomena we call reality is neither mundane in any way, shape, or form, nor boring. Only ego would dare to use those words in the face of Mother Nature. So yeah, I've done the personal work, I believe, and I didn't come to these set of convictions about cannabis lightly, like I was saying, and simultaneously I'm not judging others who did what I'm saying I didn't do. I'm not patting myself on my back, claiming to be better than anybody who has a relationship in the ways I just defined that I didn't participate in, like starting really young, doing it very heavily, all the time, right away. The kinds of things that anybody might pitfall into with anything that has the potential. Because I think I said this in another segment a couple days ago or a day ago, the real gateway isn't any of the drugs. Like, there's all this, we are always pointing the finger. Let me step back. Let's talk about purely materialistic terms. Purely just Newtonian physics. Cannabis is not a gateway drug. The way it functions and interacts with the body does not lead you to want other substances. Alcohol, on the other hand, totally is. Alcohol gets to a point where you're drunk and you need to be drunk, and then in your state of drunkenness, you're like, well, that's kind of boring now. Let's up the ante. And it's something that your mind's addiction with alcohol, your mind's relationship, your ego mind's relationship with alcohol, it's a gateway there, right? So, in the material plane, the only way you can verify the statement that I just made is statistically. Statistically, the number of stoners, and I don't like that term, I don't like self-identifying it, the number of people who consume pot exclusively in preference over other substances, I think exceed the number of people who start with cannabis and then immediately proceed to harder and harder drugs. And you'll note, it is really important, worth pausing here and paying attention and acknowledging that calling anything a gateway drug is nonsense. Because even if the drug is a drug and it is addictive and habit forming, a human being by themselves will have, a set of odds towards gatewaying, running through some sort of mental, spiritual, physiological gate towards heavier use of something more intense. But a group of people, and those odds would be low. A group of people, though, engaging in the dynamic of peer pressure or peer, one-upmanship or peer, keeping up with the Smiths kind of all ego-driven behavior, upping the ante type behaviors. That's where your gateway is. And then it doesn't matter whether the first thing that your friends offered you was huffing glue, which people still do, by the way. That's one of the most dangerous and cheapest street drugs out there is, spray cans and fucking Elmer's glue. Well, you got to do shit to it, right? I'm not going to get into that. But my point is, the ego by itself is prone to addictive behavior. Whether you are a human being that does not have a history of addicts in their past, or you do, we can't pin it all. We can't blame it all on just physiology. We can't blame it all on just chemical addiction to that chemical substance. We can't pin it all just on ego, even. But holy shit, is ego much more of a functioning gateway, right? Like, alcohol doesn't have language-driven consciousness. Now, from a spiritual standpoint, we say all things are imbued with consciousness because consciousness is manifesting them, right? Absolutely. And while we sometimes might imagine that the alcohol literally calls to us, That's not the subatomic particles of booze in your cup literally talking to you. That's your own ego mind doing a little projection, matrix game trick playing, because your own ego is assigned the task of trying to seduce you into problematic ego trap, situations. That's the job. That's the poor ego just doing its job, trying to trip you up, and trying to get you hooked on something. What? Itself, if it can, first and foremost, but other things to help enable itself to be your best friend in your mind experience of yourself. And it's funny, right? It gets a little crazy. You wonder why quote-unquote crazy people often talk about themselves or aspects of themselves in the third person. Maybe, just maybe, there's a phenomenological reason why. Because our true self, that I was talking about this in my last segment. Ooh, it's 4:19. Oh, it's 4:18. It's 4:18. Counting down. I'm already lit, but as the ritual goes, let us smoke the bowl during the window of like 4 something to 4:30 something, and all cheers and toast each other at the 20. Yeah, man. There's something awesome about being mid-sentence and then hitting the bowl. Totally clears you out. No, ego is your own... Totally forgot what I was saying for a hot second. Ego is the gateway. I wanted to touch on that because I was left with a lot of lingering thoughts. So, I mean, if we want to... And here's where meditation and transcendental systems of practice, we got to get past all the labels and really focus on organic, real shit. 100%. Like, what works because it works, not because someone forced you to believe in it. You know? What works because that's what your body does. And that's what your mind does. What works because that's what your spirit does. And meditation is in that category. Meditation is something. Now, we've spun out a bunch of different variations on meditation and a bunch of different... How much of that, you wonder, might be ego? Piling on stuff to subtly, ever so subtly, in the disguise of presenting us meditation, seduce us away from actually nailing the real concrete act of meditating. Which is one of those activities it's really hard to describe, because it's really subtle and it's really hard to suss out in the first place. As a person who first turned to cannabis, it was presented to me recreationally, and I said, "Nah, I like drinking better," and I didn't touch cannabis for years, right? Like I was just saying, the first time, not much happened. And then I'd been a drinker for a while. And I went to a party that was not explained to me was going to be a dry party. But it was a bunch of happy-go-lucky, hippies or stoners, whatever label you associate with folks that are spiritual and earthy and enjoy cannabis and enjoy, communing with one another instead of getting shit-faced drunk with one another. Because that's what they did. They gathered in a big group and they smoked cannabis, and the objective was not to, as often the case might be with drinking, to get to that place where we don't care anymore, or get to that place where we feel so relaxed we can go to sleep comfortably, or get to that place where we're puking our brains out, or get to that place where we're so blacked out we have so much fun we don't remember it the next day, right? So that none of that was their objective. It was such the eye-opening experience. Because I foolishly approached it kind of like drinking, in as much as that I'd been really caught up I'd been really frustrated the whole time going to this party. It wasn't in our hometown. We went out of town, up the coast, and a buddy of mine, a roommate of mine, and we crashed there, so it's not like we were going to drive home. And the whole time on the way up there, I was like, got to pick up a lot of beer. I was flush. I was making a lot of money at the time, and I wanted to be that awesome, cool, who's this new guy with all the good beer, you know? My friend must have been laughing his ass off deep down inside the whole way up. Because I was clearly fixated, and I was, you know, presenting the whole notion. And he and I were drinking buddies, mind you, back in the day. Gentlemen drinkers we were. We tried to drink as responsible as humanly possible, as technologically possible. And back then there was no such thing as Uber. And taxi cabs were, you know, in our neck of the woods, they're few and far between, and certainly weren't cruising around looking for fares. You'd like call a special number and wait 45 minutes for some guy to drive down from God knows where. So, long story short, it was an amazing experience. And I'll tell that story another time probably. It's one of my favorite stories in person. When smoking with other people socially, because it's a lot of fun. A lot of crazy, nonsensy things happened. A lot of, like, first time being under the influence of cannabis kind of things. And the worst, I had technically a bad experience in that while this is really hard to do, I got myself to puke my own brains out. But, and that's because I ate too much chocolate. Well, let's be honest. When you eat the entire box of C's chocolate candies to yourself, and keep in mind, I don't like C's chocolate candies. Never have, and most definitely Double Deluxe now. No, don't, and not since that day. But I was more stoned or more high than I realized because my ego mind was in such an ego-strong place. I'd sort of blocked out any acknowledgement of a phenomenological change. And I guess I was just sort of keeping my experience in my head as normal as possible while being totally silly and like getting really, really high. And I was either talking too much or I wasn't talking at all. So that all was. But then the munchies hit, and that's a real thing, and that's because. See, people say, like, those are the effects, blah, 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 cannabis is intoxicating. Like, no. Cannabis is genuinely, truly medicine. It's medicine we've been deprived of for so long that in consuming it, especially if you do it with the mentality of it is a party substance like alcohol, then your body's, like, not prepared to receive the nutrition and the healing. So you get this, like, effect. And while I'm sure people have smoked a lot and then gotten nauseous or spinny, that's from the first thing that cannabis does is heighten your senses. So if you're not accustomed to that and you're also really sort of kind of laden with stuff that slows your senses down, that can be really disorienting, right? But it's sort of rare for any given individual to encounter that and have it be a consistent thing. Every time they smoke pot, they get nauseous. Quite obviously, cannabis is known to alleviate nausea. It's one of the original sort of hardcore arguments for it to be accepted as for medicinal use was that it was the only thing that anybody suffering from the effects of fighting cancer with the usual stuff, especially back then when we first started, when the movement first started. I wasn't officially part of it other than intellectually, and in terms of sharing with my own community of friends. But when the movement first started to transition it to medicinal, I had been smoking for a bit, and this is my point of today's episode. I had been smoking for a while at that point. But and I had been introduced to it as a party thing, but I'd also been introduced to it by people who were very thoughtful and revered it as sacred medicine, not just medicine. You know, it wasn't Tylenol; it was a gift from the gods, and that was the majority. I guess the majority of the people who influenced me and my attitudes and my perceptions, my understandings about cannabis, and who taught me the most about cannabis, during my years living in Northern California, where there's a much more advanced and sort of stabilized and normalized cannabis culture. Southern California, it's not. It's very kind of. There's a lot of cannabis. There were at the time, obviously, people who smoked cannabis, but it was really way more underground, and it was its use was much more marginalized because it was cannabis got co-opted by dealers of other drugs, for sure, because they wanted it to be a gateway drug or used it, sold it with the intent for themselves to be the gateway. Sold you some weed, sold you some weed, sold you some weed. Oh, hey, by the way, here's some meth. Here's some whatever the fuck else I offer. And then sort of peer pressure using ego mechanisms, using, language commands that the egos respond to, sort of leveraging a person's attitude that might have previously not want. Oh, they just wanted to get weed. Now they're partying with other stuff. Never mind about partying. Partying, it's easy to get. If you're partying and your attitude is I'm consuming XYZ to party, then it doesn't matter what the XYZ is, right? I drink alcohol to party. I do lines of coke to party. And I think that is ego. To turn the consumption of toxic substances, or even healing substances, in the case of cannabis, and arguably psilocybin. How do we know to draw the distinction between the toxic ones and the healing ones? Well, one pretty stupid, obvious one is that the organically grown plants that come out of the earth that have these interesting effects. And I'm not saying there isn't ever anywhere on the planet a toxic plant. Of course there is. But, this is natural and organic. And there's cultural traditions that date back from, centuries before today's modern attitudes about them as plants that that are informed. Every culture in the world, in its ancient roots, has medicine books, and cannabis is right there next to all the other ones, even the ones that are poisonous, because even poison in highly focused and very small doses has its uses. Just like think about it, radiation treatment for killing cancer. Well, I'm not a big fan, and I personally wouldn't choose it. That's a choice I'm making. It is, to some degree or another, somewhat effective in some cases for some people to target the cancer cells with what you must never forget is radioactive poison. So the problem, one of the biggest problems we have culturally right now, around a normative middle of the road culture and in cannabis culture, is this mishmash, this befuddlement with those words and those labels. That's why I'm sharing this, my crazy rambling thoughts about this to the world, because I think it would behoove us. It would be best, and I don't mean this in a self-oriented way. I don't want to just benefit the cannabis community or the cannabis industry. I mean the species of humanity. It would be the best for our communities, because we're all going to have to live together, smokers and non-smokers, right? It would be best for all of our communities, for us as individuals, and if as we change the law and the taboo around cannabis, that we do it with the best information possible and with the best comprehension or perception of the drug, of the plant possible. Pardon my Freudian slip. Because what's a drug? Coffee's a drug if you think about it hard enough. Think about it. Go back and look at the bare bones, most simple clinical definition of what a drug is, and then really deprive yourself of caffeine for a week and then drink it. You probably won't make it the whole week, just in the depriving part, right? I wake up every day and say, I'm going to drink less coffee. And every day I make an 8-cup pot of coffee. The fuck are we talking about, right? And let me tell you that. I can say, people say, well, you're the same way about weed. And I'm like, well, perhaps I am. Or perhaps it might be perceived that I am that way, because I do enjoy consuming it a lot. But if you said to me, I challenge you to not smoke weed for the next 2 weeks, I'd go, okay. I wouldn't bat an eye or sweat a bullet. I'd go, wait, let me pack one last bowl, boom, and be done with it. And then not smoke for the rest of the week. And my body's not going to experience pain. My mind's not going to experience anxiety. My spirit isn't going to experience sorrow. So, and I know this. Hold on, here it comes. I've been watching the countdown clock. I've now got 4 minutes and 20 seconds left. Ding! Thanks for listening, folks. I was saying, I've done this before, like, I have had the very scary moment of waking up in San Francisco at a friend of a friend of a friend's house on a couch where, like, don't quite remember who all came with me and how all we got there, because we were drinking and smoking at the same time. Mind you, I think that's important, and also it's important to address that in that era at that time, I did go from being introduced and being taught about it from a respect and revere it as a spiritual thing, to also, falling into the pitfall of like, well, most of the people my age party with it, and let's party. That's why I'm here addressing these issues. I have had that kind of scary moment of like, do I have a problem with this thing? Can I just stop and never, and not feel withdrawals? And I did every time I've set it down. Do I sometimes say to my friends or say out loud to somebody, I'm like, I'm going to take a vacation, and then sort of don't? Totally. But, I'm also struggling to quit cigarettes, which categorically is in the other column. Like that shit is scientifically engineered to hook you faster than heroin. And sorry, heroin, for beating up on you. You just don't have, despite the show, Breaking Bad, you don't have an army of corporate scientists backed by, an endless pool of corporate money engineering the shit out of you. So yeah, that's Cannabis Talk for today. The incorrigible Mr. Zeppo rambling about, in circles, about the stuff he thinks is important. Sorry, guys. I really do bring this to you guys with a spirit of humility and fun and kindness and respect and love, and tough love sometimes, right? And in the hopes that other like-minded individuals would be like, hey, that's a valid point. He could probably say it quicker and less rambly, but it's a valid point. That's all I'm asking for, is that we build consensus. Because just like with alcohol, let's look at it. Let's take alcohol's history really quick. 1 minute and 30-second crash course on the history of alcohol. It was unregulated, and then we regulated it, and then we discovered people, even with it regulated under regulation, were having addiction problems. And this is way back in the day, right? Model T Fords and everything. And obviously, alcoholism was an issue. People were dying. People were dying of drinking alcohol. Lots of drinking people, lots of drinkers refuse to accept that that's a real thing until it's too late, until they see someone die or they get that sick. And then we outlawed it. We outlawed it hard. And well, guess what? We provided next to nothing in terms of services, physical, bodily, services for those people who are contending with the addiction. And then we killed each other over it, and then we gave in and said, fine, we're going to bring it back, but then we're going to regulate it. But then we regulated it from the point of view of the user has a problem. We didn't regulate it from the point of view of like our understanding of it culturally is what helps define whether or not the user has a problem. I'll come back and talk about this more because this is slightly more important to me right now than even the politics and stuff. It all comes back to self-liberation. Remember that, folks. Liberate yourselves first. Gotta happen in the mind before it can happen in the streets. I gotta go. 23 seconds left. May peace, love, and grooviness be with you.